This is a 4mm circular fisheye lens with insane 225-degree field of view. It literally gives you a really distorted view of the world, and it is one of the craziest lenses that you can buy that doesn't come with a crazy price. So we will have a look at this lens, and I'll also share with you some tips and tricks that you should know when shooting with this fisheye lens. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here, welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to have a look at this 7Artisans 4mm f2.8 fisheye lens. We will also do a bit of comparison with two similar lenses, the Laowa 4mm f2.8 and also the Meike 3.5mm f2.8, and see which one is the king of the crazy fisheye lens. This 7Artisans 4mm f2.8 lens is a circular fisheye lens designed for crop sensor mirrorless camera, and it is available for the Sony E, Fujifilm X, Canon EOS M, and also Meike 4mm. The sample I use in this review is a Meike 4mm mount sent to me by 7Artisans, but optically the design is the same for all the different versions, so my test results in this review can also be applied to the other versions as well. It is a fully mechanical, fully manual lens with no electronic features, no autofocus. The size of the lens is quite small, and even though the lens is made of metal, it is not really heavy. The weight is only around 200 grams. Compare this with the Meike 3.5mm fisheye and the Laowa 4mm fisheye. The size of this 7Artisans lens is in between the Meike, which is the largest, and the Laowa, which is the smallest. Now, a small lens is usually a good thing, but not in this case. The small size of the Laowa actually gives the Laowa a bit of disadvantage, and I'll explain to you why in a second. All these fisheye lenses have an extruded front element, so there's no front filter thread for you to install a front filter. Well, but since the field of view is over 180 degrees, so it will be impossible to install any front filter anyway. The focus ring of the 7Artisans lens is at the front of the lens, and the focus ring is quite smooth. The focus flow is around 45 degrees. With such a wide angle lens, you have very deep depth of field even when you are shooting at f2.8, so you don't really need precise focus control, so just a 45-degree focus flow is still okay. The aperture ring is at the back of the lens, and it is declicked because the aperture ring is quite narrow and it is located near the lens mount. So 7Artisans, they have added a nitto knob to the aperture ring, so you can control the aperture a lot easier. Now, while I do appreciate 7Artisans do this to make the control easier, I would prefer the knob is a little bit smaller, because when I grab the camera, quite often the knob would just poke into my finger and also make me move the aperture ring unintentionally. My other little complaint would be the lens cap. So the lens comes with a metal front lens cap that fits onto the lens like this. It just relies on friction to stay on the lens, and I find it's quite easy to remove the lens cap by accident, especially when I put the camera into the camera bag or take it out from the camera bag. But to be fair, most fisheye lenses also have this problem, and it's always very tricky to create a nice front lens cap for fisheye lens. I also don't really like the lens cap for the Meike lens as well. Having said that, Laowa's lens cap feel much better and more secure than this 7Artisans lens. 7Artisans says this lens has a 225-degree field of view, so this is ridiculously wide, is wider than 180 degree, which means the lens can capture not just everything in front of the lens but also behind the lens as well. So I still can't really figure out how does it work, but it is just pretty crazy. The 225-degree field of view is not only wider than Laowa's 210-degree field of view, but also slightly wider than Meike's 220-degree field of view. Now, of course, these are all factory's claim figures, so let's do a bit of comparison of some real-world photo that I shot with these three lenses. First, this is the photo that I shot with the 7Artisans lens, because I want to compare the field of view of all the three different lenses. So I have the camera set up on a tripod and the camera points straight forward. But if you look at the photo, you can see the legs of the tripod and even a bit of my leg as well, even though I was standing behind the tripod. So you can see how ridiculously wide its field of view is. So when you are taking photos or video with this lens, you may have to move the camera forward a little bit, maybe hold the camera a little bit more to the front or move your body to the front. And also be careful how you position your fingers when you're holding the camera to minimize the amount of your body and your hand and fingers captured by this lens. I said minimize because it's really quite hard to completely eliminate. And now let's compare it with the photos I captured with the Laowa and the Meike fisheye lenses. Compared with the Laowa, the 7Artisans definitely can capture slightly wider view angle. There isn't a huge amount of difference, but it is noticeable if you pay attention to the edge of the photo. And compare it with the Meike, this time I can't really see any difference even though the 7Artisans is supposed to have a slightly wider field of view. So if there is actually any difference, it is so small that it's not really noticeable and probably doesn't really matter. Now, I mentioned previously Laowa's smaller size is actually a disadvantage. The reason is because the camera cannot just capture everything in front but also a little bit behind, as I mentioned before. So if you use a camera that has a decent size grip, for example like the GH6 I used for this review, then your grip can also easily appear in the photo, and that's just something there is not much you can do to avoid it. So if you look at all the photos again, you can see the GH6 grip in all the three photos, but it is most obvious with the Laowa lens despite its field of view is slightly narrower. It is because the lens is smaller, so the front element of the lens is sitting closer to the back of the camera, so that makes the grip more visible, while the 7Artisans and the Meike, they are both slightly larger, so the front element is sitting a bit more forward and therefore the grip is not quite as visible in the photo. Another thing you may have noticed is, if you look at the top of the photo, with the photo captured by the Laowa lens, the top edge is slightly cut off, so you don't have a perfect circle shape, while the 7Artisans and the Meike both would give you a perfect circle. I do want to remind you guys that I'm doing this review with a micro four thirds camera which has a 2x crop factor, and the 7Artisans and the Laowa are both available for the APS-C camera as well. So if you use the Laowa lens on an APS-C camera, then you will be able to get a perfect circle in your photo. For some reason, Meike's 3.5mm lens is only available for micro four thirds cameras. Now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and we will compare the photo from all these three fisheye lenses together so you can see the difference. If we zoom in the center and check the photos at 200% zoom, at the maximum aperture f2.8, the three lenses all performs pretty well. But if you look at the roof area of the white building, I would say the 7Artisans is the sharpest out of the three, a little bit sharper than the Laowa, while the Meike is slightly softer than the other two. But even with the Meike, I think the center is still perfectly usable at f2.8. From f4 onwards, all the three lenses are very sharp, so there isn't much difference between them. The sharpness remains really good until around f8, and from f11 onwards, the lens would become a little bit softer due to diffraction. And now let's have a look at the edge. If we compare the photos all shot at f2.8, they are all very similar. I have spent 10 minutes going back and forth between all these three photos. I can't say which one is the sharpest. But if I really have to pick, I would say both the 7Artisans and the Laowa are slightly sharper than the Meike. But the difference is just so minor that I don't think it matters at all when you are shooting real world photos. Let's have a look at these lenses close-up shooting performance. All these lenses can focus pretty close to the subject. The 7Artisans minimum focus distance is 8.5 cm, and that means the front element of the lens is just a few centimeters from your subject when it's focusing at the minimum focus distance. And while it's not giving you macro close-up capability, you can still get pretty decent magnification ratio. The minimum focus distance of the Meike and the Laowa are also very similar. There is less than 1 cm difference, but the 7Artisans does have slightly higher magnification ratio than the other two lenses. All three lenses delivers pretty good sharpness when shooting at the minimum focus distance, even at f2.8. The only thing you need to watch out is that since the camera and the lens is very close to the subject when shooting with any of these lenses at the minimum focus distance, so combining that with the ultra wide field of view is extremely easy to cast shadow onto your subject or the foreground if the light source is not behind your subject. While these lenses can focus really close, but because of the very short focal length, so you can't really dissolve the background into bokeh balls at all, so there isn't much bokeh for me to talk about in this review. With the 7Artisans lens, there is a bit of vignetting when shooting at f2.8. Stopping down to f4 would remove most of the vignetting, and from f5.6 onward, vignetting isn't really noticeable anymore. The vignetting performance of the Meike and Laowa is also very similar. A bit of vignetting at f2.8 and it becomes much less obvious once you stop down to f4, so there isn't too big a difference between all these three lenses. The next thing I want to do is compare the color rendering of these lenses. So here are three photos all shot with the daylight white balance, and I use my aperture 120D light to light up my room. All the photos were shot at f2.8 and the same camera settings as well. First thing I want to mention is the exposure or the brightness of all these three photos are virtually the same. Now, if we look at the colors, the photos shot with the 7Artisans and the Meike lens have very similar color tone, so they are virtually the same in terms of color rendering. Look at the 7Artisans box, my Lego box, and also the background. The color matches almost perfectly in these two photos. But now, if you look at the Laowa lens, then you can probably see the Laowa lens renders a bit cooler in color temperature than the other two lenses. It also has a little bit more magenta tint than the other two photos as well. We will now look at chromatic aberration. The 7Artisans has pretty good overall chromatic aberration control. I don't see too much color fringing in most of my photos. Even some high contrast photos shot at f2.8 still have pretty minimal amount of chromatic aberration. The Meike lens is also very good in this area. I don't see much chromatic aberration in most of my photos that shot with the Meike lens. The Laowa lens has a little bit more chromatic aberration than the other two lenses. I quite often would see a little bit of purple fringing, especially near the edge of the photo. Now, it's still not bad, but it's definitely more noticeable than the other two lenses. And now we will have a look at distortion. So these are fisheye lenses, so of course there will be distortion, a lot of distortion, otherwise they are not fisheye lenses. So let's have a look at these three photos, each shot with one of these fisheye lens. The distortion pattern is very similar between the 7Artisans and the Meike lens, but the Laowa lens looks a little bit different, probably because Laowa's field of view is not quite as wide, so the photo seems slightly less distorted compared to the photo from the other two fisheye lenses. With the extruded front element and the insanely wide field of view, lens flare performance is really important to these fisheye lenses, as if the lens has bad lens flare performance, then it could really ruin the lens no matter how sharp and nice everything else is. Fortunately, the lens flare performance of all these three lenses are all pretty good. With the 7Artisans lens, contrast remains really good even when shooting directly into the sun on a bright sunny day and there isn't much ghosting. The Meike is also very similar to the 7Artisans, also very well controlled, but with a little bit less ghosting than the 7Artisans. The Laowa is not bad too, but at some certain angle you can see a big orange blob of ghosting that the other two lenses don't have. Okay, now let's have a look at the Sunstars from these fisheye lenses. Interestingly, all these three fisheye lenses, they have 7 braid aperture design, so all of them would render 14-point Sunstars when you stop down the lens. With the 7Artisans lens, the Sunstars become visible when you stop down to around f8. With the Meike, you need to stop down a little bit more to around f11 to get similar amount of Sunstars. And with the Laowa lens, you can already see a bit of Sunstars from f4, and the Sunstars are quite sharp once you reach f8. When you stop down these lenses to the minimum aperture f16, the Sunstars from the Laowa looks the best to my eyes. The Sunstar look really well defined with long tails. The 7Artisans also look pretty decent, but just not quite as sharp as the Laowa. Meike's Sunstars looks alright, like I won't say it looks ugly, but it's not really as nice as the other two lenses. Circular fisheye lens is usually mostly for photo, but because this 7Artisans lens is such a small and lightweight lens that weighs only 200 grams, so that makes this lens suitable for flying with a drone to capture some ultra wide-angle video from the sky. Unfortunately, I don't have access to any drone that can fly this lens up into the sky, but I have seen some test footage from 7Artisans, so go to their website if you want to check out some of the test video that's shot with a drone using this lens. After going through all these test results, which of these fisheye lens do you like the most? It's really quite hard to pick my favorite because each of these lenses have their own pros and cons. For example, I really like the physical design of the Laowa lens. There's a focus tab on the lens and the aperture ring has clicks, and also the Sunstars is the most beautiful of the three lenses, but you could easily see the camera grip in the photo, and if you use it on a Micro Four Thirds camera, the top and the bottom edge of the image circle got cropped a little bit, and it also has more lens flare than the other two lenses. The 7Artisans and the Meike have very similar overall image quality. I think I prefer the 7Artisans slightly more because it is slightly tiny bit sharper and also renders more beautiful Sunstars, but the Meike has slightly better lens flare performance. However, one thing the Meike can't match is that it is only available for the Micro Four Thirds cameras, while the 7Artisans is also available for the APS-C cameras as well as Micro Four Thirds. So if you are an APS-C shooter, then you can only choose between 7Artisans and the Laowa, and each of them has its own pros and cons. And if you are enjoying this comparison review, I've also done a few other similar comparison reviews on my channel, so go check them out now, or you can subscribe to my channel and come back and watch them in the future.